December 1966. The jungle near Long Tan in Phuoc Thu Province. Rain hammered down through the triple canopy as an Australian SAS patrol of 5 men lay motionless in the undergrowth, watching a Viet Cong supply column pass 15 meters away. For 6 hours they had not moved, not spoken, not made a single sound. Then the radio crackled. An American liaison officer, breaking silence to request a position update. The sound echoed through the jungle like a gunshot. 37 enemy. Soldiers turned toward the noise. The Australians survived the contact that followed, but 3 VC escaped to alert nearby forces. The patrol had to abort after 9 days of perfect stealth, destroyed by 15 seconds of American radio. Protocol. By 1971, Australian SAS had achieved kill ratios exceeding 100 to 1, while suffering only 2 combat deaths. American Special Forces, in the same region, averaged 6 to 1. The Pentagon called the Australian statistics exaggerated. Military analysts claimed the methodology was unsustainable. Command structures declared the Australian approach incompatible with modern warfare. You think you know special operations? You're wrong. Why did elite Australian soldiers refuse to operate with American units after 1967? How did silence become more powerful than firepower in the jungles of Vietnam? What made noise discipline so critical that Australians would rather die than break it? Stay until the end, because what happened between these allied forces revealed a fundamental divide about how wars are won, and why sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one you are fighting, but the one standing beside you with a radio. The scene near Long Tan was not isolated. It repeated with variations across every area where Australian SAS operated alongside American forces in Vietnam. The pattern was consistent and maddening to the Australians. They would insert into hostile territory using helicopter insertions. Designed for stealth, they would move to observation positions through terrain that required hours of painstaking silence. They would establish patrol bases using techniques refined over 20 years of jungle warfare. Then American units would arrive in the same area with helicopters announcing their presence for kilometers, with radio communications constant and undisciplined, with movement techniques that sounded like armor columns crashing through vegetation. The Americans would compromise Australian positions without knowing the Australians existed. The result was blown operations, increased danger, and mounting Australian frustration with allies who seemed incapable of operating quietly. The frustration was rooted in fundamentally different operational philosophies that had evolved from different military experiences. American Special Forces doctrine in 1966 emphasized mobility, firepower, and communication. The strategy was built around the ability to call in massive support when contact occurred. American reconnaissance teams were eyes for artillery and air power. They located enemy forces, then withdrew while superior firepower destroyed targets. The system worked when support was available and terrain permitted its employment. It required constant communication with command elements, frequent position updates, coordination with aviation assets, and the underlying assumption that American technological and firepower superiority would prevail in any engagement. Australian SAS doctrine had evolved from completely different experiences and assumptions. 20 years of jungle warfare in New Guinea, Malaya, and Borneo had taught the Australians that stealth was the ultimate force multiplier. In environments where the enemy knew terrain intimately and outnumbered you dramatically, noise meant death. The Australian approach emphasized invisibility, silence, and self-sufficiency. Patrols inserted into enemy territory for weeks at a time with minimal communication, operating under radio silence except for critical messages. They gathered intelligence through patient observation, engaged enemy forces only when tactical. Advantage was overwhelming, and extracted intelligence that enabled larger operations. The system worked because it denied the enemy knowledge of friendly presence until engagement was inevitable, and by then conditions favored the Australians. Completely. The philosophical divide manifested in every aspect of operations. American forces maintained constant radio contact, checking in hourly, reporting movements, coordinating with multiple headquarters elements. Australian forces went days without transmitting, operating under the assumption that every radio transmission was intercepted by enemy signals intelligence and every transmission revealed an approximate location. American forces moved during daylight and established defensive positions at night. Australian forces moved primarily at night and observed during day from positions so perfectly camouflaged that they were invisible meters away. American forces cleared landing zones and established fire bases with engineering support. Australian forces inserted into areas where no landing zones existed and operated without any base infrastructure. The critical difference was noise discipline. For the Australian SAS, silence was not merely tactical preference. It was a survival imperative and operational foundation. Every sound was controlled. Every piece of equipment was secured to eliminate noise. Weapons were wrapped in cloth to prevent metallic sounds. Gear was arranged so nothing rattled or scraped. Movement was practiced until it became silent, regardless of terrain. Hand signals replaced verbal communication. Radio silence was maintained, even when circumstances made communication desirable. The discipline was absolute, because the consequences of noise were catastrophic. In a hostile jungle surrounded by enemy forces, detection meant engagement against overwhelming odds. Silence meant survival. The equation was simple and proven through decades of experience. American forces approached noise differently. Constant. Communication was considered essential for coordination and safety. Command needed to know where units were located. Aviation needed to coordinate flight paths. Artillery needed to deconflict fire missions. The communication infrastructure required radio traffic that Australian doctrine considered operationally suicidal. American troops moved through the jungle with less concern for noise because American doctrine assumed that if contact occurred, superior firepower would prevail. The assumption was valid in many circumstances. It was catastrophically wrong in circumstances where the Australian SAS operated. The first major incident that crystallized Australian frustration occurred in February 1967. An Australian patrol was conducting surveillance of a suspected Viet Cong base camped deep in enemy-controlled territory. The five-man team had been in position for 6 days, gathering detailed intelligence on enemy strength, supply patterns, and defensive preparations. The intelligence was critical for planning a larger operation. On day 6, an American reconnaissance team was inserted into an area 3 kilometers away for a separate mission. The American insertion was loud, with multiple helicopters and door guns firing suppressive bursts into landing zones. The insertion technique was standard American procedure designed to suppress potential ambushes. It also announced American presence to every enemy force within 10 kilometers. The Viet Cong base camp the Australians were observing went on full alert. Sentries were doubled. Patrols increased. Defensive positions were manned. The VC clearly knew that Allied forces were operating nearby and had taken appropriate security measures. The Australian patrol, compromised by American activity they had not been informed about, had to extract early with incomplete intelligence. The operation they had risked their lives to prepare was cancelled because the intelligence was inadequate. Australian commanders filed formal complaints about coordination failures. American commanders responded that their operations had been properly coordinated through command channels. The Australian response was blunt: coordination through headquarters. meant nothing when the enemy had ears and the Americans were shouting. The incident report detailed the problem with precision that American staff officers found insulting. Australian doctrine required informed all-eyed units within operational radius before conducting insertions or movements. American doctrine required informing command headquarters who would deconflict operations through planning cells. The Australian approach assumed that soldiers on the ground needed information to maintain operational security. The American approach assumed that centralized command would manage deconfliction without requiring ground units to communicate laterally. Both approaches were logical within their own doctrinal frameworks. They were completely incompatible in practice. The sound that symbolized the divide was the radio transmission. For Americans, the radio was a lifeline and command tool. Constant communication ensured that command knew the tactical situation, that units could request support, that operations were coordinated. The sound of radio traffic was reassuring. It meant you were connected to a larger organizational structure that provided security and support. For Australians, the radio was necessary and used only when absolutely required. Every transmission was a potential death sentence. The sound of radio traffic was an alarm indicating that operational security was compromised. Same technology, opposite symbolic meaning. The difference reflected fundamentally different assumptions about what made soldiers safe in hostile environments. Australian patrol techniques were built around radio silence taken to extremes that shocked American observers. Patrols would deploy for 14 days with perhaps 3 radio transmissions total. Check-in upon insertion, confirming safe landing. Situation report if significant intelligence was gathered. Extraction request when patrol cycle was complete. That was all. No hourly position updates. No routine communication. No chatter. American liaison officers watching Australian operations were disturbed by the silence. They interpreted it as communication failure or lack of discipline. They could not conceive that the silence was itself the tactic, that every moment of radio silence increased patrol effectiveness by reducing enemy ability to locate and target friendly forces. The training that produced this discipline was brutal and unforgiving. Australian SAS selection and training emphasized noise discipline to a degree that American Special Operations training did not match. Candidates were failed for single instances of unnecessary noise during field exercises. Patrols were graded on their ability to move silently through various terrain types. Equipment was modified and tested until every rattle and scrape was eliminated. The soldiers who completed training had internalized noise discipline to the point where silence was reflexive rather than conscious choice. They moved quietly because they had moved quietly for so many thousands of hours that moving any other way felt wrong. American Special Forces training emphasized different skills: small unit tactics, weapons proficiency, survival skills, communication procedures. The training was excellent for producing soldiers who could operate in small teams with minimal supervision. It did not produce the obsessive noise discipline that Australian training created. American soldiers could move quietly when required. Australian soldiers could not move loudly even when they wanted to. The difference was the degree of internalization. For Americans, silence was a tactical choice. For Australians, silence was a fundamental identity. The philosophical divide extended to how both forces viewed risk and support. American doctrine minimized risk through overwhelming support. If a reconnaissance team made contact, airstrikes and artillery would destroy the enemy. If extraction was needed, helicopters would come under gunship cover. If casualties occurred, medical evacuation was immediate. The support infrastructure was massive and capable. It made American soldiers bold because they knew that the full weight of American military power would support them if things went wrong. The boldness was warranted by the capabilities backing it up. But the boldness also made American soldiers noisier because the consequences of noise were mitigated by available support. Australian doctrine accepted higher risk through self-sufficiency. Patrols operated beyond artillery range and often beyond helicopter range. If contact occurred, the patrol would break contact and evade rather than calling in support that might not be available. If casualties occurred, the patrol would carry wounded rather than requesting evacuation that would reveal position. If things went wrong, the patrol would solve problems using their own resources rather than relying on external support. The self-sufficiency made Australian soldiers cautious because they knew no one was coming to save them if they made mistakes. The caution manifested as obsessive attention to noise discipline and operational security because those were the only reliable defenses available. The incident that nearly destroyed Australian-American cooperation in Phuoc Thu Province occurred in August 1967. An Australian patrol was inserted to observe a trail junction where intelligence indicated regular enemy supply movement. The patrol spent 3 days reaching the observation position, moving with exquisite care to avoid detection. They established a position with perfect sight lines and concealment, prepared to observe for up to 10 days. On day 2 of observation, an American patrol was inserted nearby for a separate mission. The American patrol did not know the Australians were there because American headquarters had not informed them. The Australians did not know the Americans were coming because Australian headquarters had not been informed by American command. The American patrol moved toward the same trail junction the Australians were observing. The American point man passed within 5 meters of the Australian position without seeing the perfectly camouflaged Australians. The American team leader then used his radio to report reaching the trail junction. The transmission was loud, undisciplined, and included detailed position information. The Viet Cong monitoring radios now knew that Allied forces were at that specific trail junction. Within an hour, the VC had sent a reinforced platoon to investigate. The firefight that resulted killed 2 Americans and wounded 4 more. The Australians, still undetected, provided covering fire that allowed the Americans to extract. The Australian patrol then had to abort their mission because the area was fully compromised. The after-action review was explosive. Australian commanders demanded to know why they had not been informed of American operations in their area. American commanders explained that the operation had been properly coordinated at headquarters level. The Australian response was that headquarters coordination meant nothing when ground units were not informed. The American response was that ground units did not need to know about every operation occurring in the region. The Australian response was that noise discipline required knowing where other forces were operating so patrols could avoid compromise. The American response was that Australian paranoia about noise was excessive and counterproductive. The argument escalated until senior commanders had to intervene. The compromise was unsatisfying to both sides. Australian SAS would inform American headquarters of their patrol locations. American forces would attempt to avoid those areas when possible. No guarantee was made that Australian patrols would be informed of American operations nearby. The compromise solved command relationships while failing to solve operational problems. Australian patrols continued being compromised by American noise. Australian frustration continued mounting. Informal policy developed among Australian SAS teams. Operate as if American forces did not exist. Assume any American presence would compromise operations and plan accordingly. The policy was never official. It was universally adopted. The sound of helicopter rotors became another symbol of the divide. American forces used helicopters constantly. Insertions, extractions, resupply, medical evacuation, command and control. The helicopters provided mobility and flexibility that were force multipliers in open terrain. In a jungle where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere, the helicopters announced operations with acoustic signatures that carried for kilometers. Viet Cong would hear helicopters and know that American operations were occurring in that area. They would increase patrols, set ambushes on likely routes, and generally make the area much more dangerous for any Allied forces present. The helicopters that made American forces mobile also compromised Australian forces, trying to remain undetected. Australian doctrine minimized helicopter use. Insertions were conducted at night when possible, with helicopters landing briefly and departing immediately to minimize acoustic signature. Extractions were scheduled for predetermined times to avoid radio communication requesting pickup. Resupply was avoided entirely during patrol cycles. The Australians would carry everything they needed for the entire patrol duration. Medical. Evacuation was considered only for life-threatening casualties that could not be treated in the field. The minimal helicopter used preserve operational security, but required patrol members to carry heavier loads and accept higher risk. The trade-off was considered worthwhile because stealth provided survival advantages that outweighed support disadvantages. By late 1967, Australian SAS had essentially stopped cooperating with American ground forces. They would coordinate at headquarters level to avoid territory conflicts. They would provide intelligence to American units when appropriate, but they would not conduct joint patrols, would not share operational areas, and would not rely on American support for their operations. The separation was self-imposed and considered necessary for survival. Australian commanders explained the decision in terms that were diplomatically careful but operationally blunt. American and Australian operational methods were incompatible. At tactical level, coordination required more effort than it provided in return, and Australian effectiveness was higher when operating independently. American commanders accepted the decision with mixed feelings. Some were insulted by the implicit criticism. Others were relieved to not have allies who operated so differently from American norms. The separation allowed both forces to operate according to their own doctrines without compromise. American forces continued emphasizing mobility, firepower, and communication. They achieved solid results through methods that suited their training and support capabilities. Australian forces continued emphasizing stealth, patience, and silence. They achieved exceptional results through methods that suited their training and operational philosophy. Both approaches worked. They simply could not work in the same place at the same time because the methods contradicted each other at a fundamental level. The Australians needed silence. The Americans needed communication. No amount of coordination could bridge the gap. The radio traffic that Australian patrols monitored provided constant frustration. Enemy radio discipline was often better than American radio discipline. Viet Cong used radios sparingly and spoke in code when they transmitted. American forces used radios constantly and often spoke in clear language that anyone monitoring could understand. Australian signals intelligence personnel would listen to American radio nets and cringe at the operational security failures. Detailed position. Reports transmitted without encryption. Mission objectives discussed over open channels. Casualty information broadcast that revealed unit capabilities. Every transmission was an intelligence gift to enemy forces monitoring communications. The Australians could not understand how American forces survived with such poor communication. Discipline. The answer was that American forces survived through firepower and support rather than stealth. When enemy forces located American units through radio monitoring, the resulting engagement would be decided by American artillery and air power rather than tactical surprise. The approach worked because American support capabilities were overwhelming. But it only worked at the strategic cost of allowing the enemy to choose engagement timing and location. The Americans were fighting reactive war, responding to enemy initiatives with superior firepower. The Australians were fighting proactive war, controlling engagement conditions through superior stealth. Both approaches achieved tactical success. The Australian approach achieved it with far lower resource expenditure and casualty rates. The contrast in casualty rates was stark and undeniable. Australian SAS suffered 2 combat deaths during 5 years of operations in Vietnam while achieving over 500 confirmed enemy kills. The ratio was approximately 250 to 1. American Special Forces incomparable. Operations suffered casualties at dramatically higher rates while achieving lower kill ratios. The difference was not in courage or skill. American Special Forces were exceptionally capable soldiers. The difference was in methodology. Australian silence preserved tactical surprise that allowed engagement on Australian terms. American communications sacrificed surprise in exchange for support that made engagement survivable on American terms. The Australian approach was simply more efficient at converting risk into results. American commanders studied Australian results without fully absorbing Australian methods. Reports acknowledged Australian effectiveness while expressing reservations about sustainability and scalability. The reports noted that Australian methods required training standards and selection criteria that eliminated most candidates. They noted that Australian patrol sizes were smaller than American doctrine recommended. They noted that Australian communication practices violated American command and control requirements. The reports concluded that Australian methods worked for Australians, but could not be adopted by American forces without fundamental doctrinal changes that were not feasible given existing command structures and training pipelines. The conclusion was accurate and tragic. The Americans understood what the Australians were doing, but could not do it themselves. Some individual American soldiers absorbed the lessons. Special operations personnel who observed Australian operations would adopt selected techniques, moving more quietly, using radios less frequently, observing longer before engaging. The individual adaptations improved effectiveness, but could not overcome institutional doctrine. When those soldiers returned to American units, they had to operate according to American procedures. The knowledge they gained from Australians was filed away as interesting but not applicable. The institutional inability to learn from Allied success was frustrating to soldiers who recognized that better methods existed. The sound of silence became the defining characteristic of Australian SAS operations. Enemy forces in Phuoc 2 province learned that silence meant danger. When the jungle was quiet, when no helicopters were audible, when no radio traffic betrayed Allied presence, that was when Australian patrols were operating. The psychological impact was profound. Viet Cong and NVA soldiers knew that invisible enemy forces might be observing them at any moment. The uncertainty was corrosive to morale and operational effectiveness. Enemy forces moved in larger groups for security. They avoided certain areas entirely. They conducted counter-reconnaissance patrols that consumed resources without finding. Australian observers who remained undetected through perfect noise discipline. The strategic impact of Australian operations was disproportionate to their numbers. Roughly 120 Australian SAS operators rotated through Vietnam during the war. Those 120 men tied down thousands of enemy soldiers through psychological pressure and intelligence collection that enabled larger operations. The force multiplication achieved through stealth and silence was remarkable. Each Australian patrol operating in enemy territory created uncertainty that affected enemy operations across a wide area. The enemy could not know where Australian forces were, so they had to assume Australian forces might be anywhere. The assumption forced enemy forces to adopt defensive postures and security measures that reduced their operational effectiveness dramatically. American forces achieved strategic impact through different means: massive firepower, extensive operations, territorial control. The American approach required vast resources and produced mixed strategic results. The Australian approach required minimal resources and produced exceptional results within a limited area. The comparison was not fair because the missions were different. Americans were trying to secure the entire country. Australians were focused on a single province, but the efficiency difference was still striking. The Australians demonstrated that small numbers of highly trained soldiers operating with perfect noise discipline could achieve strategic effects that large conventional forces achieved only through massive resource expenditure. The incident that finally severed Australian patience occurred in March 1968. An Australian patrol was conducting final surveillance before a major operation aimed at destroying Viet Cong base camp. The patrol had gathered detailed intelligence over 2 weeks of observation. The intelligence was sufficient to plan an assault with a high probability of success. The day before the assault was scheduled, an American unit conducted a sweep operation in an area adjacent to the base camp. The sweep was noisy, announced by helicopter insertions, and thoroughly telegraphed American presence. The Viet Cong base camp evacuated overnight. When the assault force arrived, they found abandoned positions and cached supplies, but no enemy personnel. 2 weeks of Australian work was wasted because an American operation had alerted the enemy. The Australian after-action report was scathing. It documented communication failures that had prevented the Australians from being informed of American operations in the area. It documented how American noise discipline had compromised Australian surveillance. It documented the strategic cost of the coordination failure. The report concluded with recommendation that Australian forces operate completely independently of American forces in future, with coordination limited to deconfliction of territory and intelligence sharing. The recommendation was approved at the highest levels. From March 1968 forward, Australian SAS essentially operated as an independent force within Phuoc 2 province. The separation was liberating for Australian forces. Without need to coordinate with American units, they could plan operations based purely on tactical considerations. Without risk of compromise from American noise, they could maintain surveillance positions for extended periods. Without American communication requirements, they could operate under radio silence that provided maximum security. The results improved immediately. Mission success rates increased. Intelligence quality improved. Enemy forces in Australian operational areas became more defensive and less effective. The separation proved that Australian methods worked best when not constrained by need to accommodate American doctrine. American forces continued operating according to their methods with continued success in different areas. The separation reduced friction between allied forces while allowing both to maximize their respective strengths. American mobility and firepower achieved results in open terrain and during large operations. Australian stealth and patience achieved results in the jungle and during intelligence collection. The war required both approaches. The mistake had been trying to integrate them at a tactical level when they were fundamentally incompatible. A separation acknowledged the reality that cooperation required recognizing limits of compatibility. The sound of silence in Australian operations became legendary among enemy forces. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that Viet Cong had specific warnings about Australian SAS. The warnings emphasized that Australian forces were invisible until engagement, that they operated in areas where no Allied presence had been detected, that they killed sentries silently and observed for days before attacking. The warnings created psychological pressure that was a force multiplier beyond any physical capability. Enemy forces feared what they could not hear or see. The fear made them cautious and defensive. Caution and defense reduced their operational effectiveness. Australian silence achieved strategic effects that no amount of American firepower could match. The methodology that produced this silence was jealously guarded. Australian SAS did not widely share their techniques with American forces after the separation. Some information was provided through official channels for intelligence cooperation. But the detailed techniques, the training methods, the tactical procedures that made Australian operations so effective remained largely Australian property. The decision to limit sharing was partly pride and partly pragmatism. The Australians had developed their methodology through 2 decades of hard experience. They were not going to give it away to allies who had shown they could not, or would, not implement it properly. The knowledge was valuable and had been earned through blood. It would remain Australian. By 1970, the pattern was completely established. Australian SAS operated independently in Phuoc 2 province with remarkable effectiveness. American forces operated throughout Vietnam with mixed results using their own methods. The two forces coordinated at strategic level, but rarely interacted at tactical level. The separation was accepted by both sides as necessary and appropriate. Australian commanders were satisfied that their forces could operate without compromise. From American noise. American commanders were satisfied that they did not have to accommodate Australian demands for silence that conflicted with American communication requirements. The compromise was successful because it acknowledged that integration was impossible and separation was preferable. The Australian withdrawal from Vietnam began in 1971. The last SAS patrols extracted from the jungle had completed 5 years of operations with results that exceeded any reasonable expectation. 2 combat deaths. Over 500 confirmed enemy kills. Hundreds of intelligence reports that enabled successful operations. Psychological impact on enemy forces that lasted long after Australian withdrawal. The record was exceptional by any measure. The record was achieved through methodology that American forces had found incompatible with their doctrine. The incompatibility had nearly destroyed Allied cooperation. The separation had preserved both the cooperation at strategic level and the effectiveness of Australian operations at tactical level. The lessons learned were documented in classified reports that circulated through military establishments of both nations. American reports acknowledged Australian effectiveness while maintaining that Australian methods were not suitable for American forces. Australian reports acknowledged American support while maintaining that American noise discipline was inadequate for special operations. Neither side fully learned from the other because neither side was willing to fundamentally change their approach. American forces continued emphasizing firepower and communication in future conflicts. Australian forces continued emphasizing stealth and silence. The pattern established in Vietnam persisted because it reflected deep cultural and doctrinal differences that transcended any single conflict. The radio that had caused so much friction sits in museums now. Display cases with historical placards explaining communication equipment used in Vietnam. The radios are silent. The frequencies are empty, but the lesson remains relevant. That technology is only as effective as the doctrine governing its use. That communication is only valuable when it does not compromise operations. That silence is sometimes more powerful than speech. The Australian SAS learned this lesson completely. They built operational methodology around silence that achieved exceptional results. The Americans never fully learned it because their institutional culture could not accommodate operations that required such minimal communication. With command structure, the sound of silence echoes through military history as a reminder of roads not taken and lessons incompletely learned. The Australian SAS in Vietnam demonstrated that small forces operating with perfect noise discipline could achieve strategic effects through stealth and patience. They demonstrated that silence was a force multiplier more powerful than many technological advantages. They demonstrated that methodology mattered more than resources when methodology was perfectly adapted to the operational environment. The demonstrations were documented, studied, and largely ignored by military establishments that preferred familiar approaches to proven but uncomfortable alternatives. The soldiers who served in those silent patrols carried the knowledge forward into later careers. Some became trainers who taught new generations of Australian Special Operations soldiers. Some became commanders who institutionalized the lessons in doctrine and training programs. Some simply kept the memories private, knowing that what they had experienced could not be easily explained to those who had not lived it. The knowledge persisted in Australian military culture as an institutional memory of how warfare could be prosecuted when stealth and silence were elevated to primary tactical considerations. The knowledge remained distinctly Australian because no other military force fully adopted the methodology that had proven so effective. The American forces who served alongside Australians or tried to carry their own lessons forward. Some learned that different approaches could achieve better results in specific circumstances. Some learned that Allied forces were not merely smaller versions of American forces operating with American methods. Some learned humility about limits of American doctrinal superiority. The learning was individual rather than institutional. American military culture continued believing that American methods were best and that other approaches were interesting anomalies rather than potentially superior alternatives. The belief persisted because admitting that allies operating with fewer resources had achieved better results was psychologically and institutionally difficult. The phrase "shut up or die" was never an official motto, but it captured Australian SAS operational philosophy with brutal accuracy. Every sound was a potential death sentence. Every radio transmission was an enemy intelligence gift. Every moment of noise was tactical advantage surrendered. The philosophy made Australian operators among the most effective special forces in military history. The philosophy also made them incompatible with Allied forces who viewed communication as an operational necessity rather than a last resort. The incompatibility was never resolved because resolution would have required one side to abandon fundamental assumptions about how special operations should be conducted. The jungle has reclaimed the patrol routes where Australian silence achieved such remarkable results. The observation positions are overgrown. The insertion points are unmarked. The places where five-man patrols spent weeks invisible to enemy forces surrounding them are indistinguishable from surrounding forest. But the lessons remain in institutional memory and classified documents. That silence is survival in a hostile environment where the enemy is everywhere. That noise discipline is not optional when outnumbered dramatically. That stealth achieves what firepower cannot when a tactical situation demands invisibility. These lessons were proven through 5 years of operations that should have changed how special operations forces thought about noise. The lessons were mostly ignored because learning them required admitting that loudness was liability and silence was strength. The admission was too difficult for military culture built around communication and coordination. The radio sits silent in the museum. The frequencies are empty. The voices that once filled the airwaves are gone. But the silence remains, carved into casualty statistics that showed Australian SAS effectiveness, written into after-action reports that documented American frustration. With Australian methods preserved in institutional memories of soldiers who learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the willingness to shut up when every instinct and every doctrine demands communication. The Australians had that willingness. The Americans did not. The difference defined operational effectiveness and determined survival in an environment where noise meant death and silence meant life. The lesson was simple. Learning it required abandoning the comfort of constant communication and accepting the isolation of perfect silence. The Australians made that choice repeatedly. They were criticized for it, isolated because of it, and vindicated by results that spoke louder than any radio transmission ever could. The silence proved more eloquent than speech. The results proved more convincing than doctrine. And the knowledge that shutting up could save lives remained with soldiers who understood that sometimes the hardest thing is not to fight, but to remain perfectly still and perfectly quiet while the enemy walks past meters away, never knowing that death is watching them from jungle that hides men, who have learned that silence is the ultimate tactical advantage and noise is the ultimate betrayal. That knowledge, earned through blood and proven through results, remains the legacy of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam, and the reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing an ally can do is make a sound at exactly the wrong moment.